What if everything you think you know about Viking life at sea is wrong? For decades, popular culture has painted the same image again and again. Vikings crossing frozen oceans, a fire burning on the deck, meat roasting, warriors laughing as warmth pushes back the cold. It feels right. It feels human. And that is exactly why it's dangerous. Because none of it is true. There was no fire on Viking ships, no cooking, no warmth, not once during a voyage. This wasn't tradition or superstition. It was necessity. A single flame on a longship wasn't comfort, it was death. Tarred wood, open decks, violent winds, tightly packed crews. One spark was all it took to turn a vessel into a floating funeral pyre. And once that reality sinks in, a far darker question emerges, one most documentaries quietly avoid. How did Viking crews survive for days, sometimes weeks, crossing the North Atlantic without ever cooking a single meal? And more disturbingly, why did they accept that suffering as normal? The answer has nothing to do with bravery in the modern sense. It has everything to do with control. Vikings didn't conquer the sea by making it comfortable. They conquered it by removing risk entirely, by engineering their lives around cold food, hunger, discipline, and endurance. This wasn't hardship by accident. It was hardship by design. And once you understand that, the Viking longship stops being a romantic symbol. It becomes something far more unsettling. A moving test of human limits. The Viking longship was never meant to be comfortable. Comfort was a liability. Speed, flexibility, and violence were the priorities, and every line of the ship's design reflects that choice. These vessels were built using clinker construction, where long oak planks overlapped like scales and were fastened together with iron rivets. The seams were sealed with thick layers of tar and pitch, substances essential for keeping seawater out, but dangerously eager to burn. Without tar, a longship would soak, swell, and rot. With it, the ship stayed fast and alive, but also permanently flammable. On a longship, fire was never a tool. It was a threat. A single spark touching tarred wood wouldn't fade or smolder. It would flare instantly, racing along planks, seams, and rigging with terrifying speed. And the sea made everything worse. Wind on open water never behaves. It shifts without warning, slams across the deck, curls under the sail, and whips back again from the stern. Any open flame would be torn apart in seconds, scattering embers across wool cloaks, wooden shields, rope lines, bedding, and sails stretched overhead. There was no protected space, no enclosed deck, no galley, no hearth, no chimney to carry smoke away. Only an open, narrow platform crowded with men, weapons, barrels, and gear, all packed tightly together to keep the ship balanced. In that environment, lighting a fire wouldn't cook a meal. It would create panic, chaos, and a burning vessel in freezing water. Vikings understood this reality with brutal clarity. They weren't reckless adventurers gambling with fate. They were experienced seafarers who respected how quickly the ocean punished mistakes. So, they didn't try to control fire at sea. They eliminated it entirely. To understand Viking discipline, you first have to understand what fire truly meant at sea. Not warmth, not comfort, but catastrophe. On a Viking longship, fire wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. If flames took hold, there was no recovery plan waiting behind it. No buckets, no pumps, no organized response. The ship itself was the only lifeline, and once it burned, survival ended with it. Abandoning ship was not an option. The North Atlantic was not open water, it was cold shock, violent waves, and rapid hypothermia. A man thrown into those seas wouldn't struggle for long. Within minutes, muscles locked, breath failed, and consciousness slipped away. Fire didn't just threaten the ship, it erased every chance of living. This reality wasn't unique to the Vikings. Even Roman and Greek vessels, broader, heavier, and far more enclosed, treated open flame as an unacceptable risk. Fire belonged on land, where it could be controlled, contained, and extinguished. At sea, it was forbidden. For Vikings, this wasn't ritual or superstition. It was physics. They understood wind behavior, material limits, and human vulnerability with brutal clarity. The ocean didn't allow second chances, and the longship offered no margin for error. So fire was removed completely, and once it was gone, everything else had to change. How they stored supplies, how they ate, how they endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion. This is where the real story begins. Not with conquest, but with adaptation. Viking seafood was never meant to be cuisine. It was logistics in its purest form. Every item carried aboard a longship was chosen around one absolute rule. Nothing could require cooking. No flame, no heat, no preparation. Once that rule was accepted, comfort disappeared immediately. There was no fresh meat waiting below deck, no warm meals to lift morale, no sense of indulgence or relief. Instead, Viking crews depended on food that could survive everything the sea threw at it. Constant moisture, salt-filled air, violent motion, weeks of storage, and handling with numb, frozen hands. Food wasn't judged by flavor, it was judged by endurance. Their staples were brutally practical. Hard flatbread, made from barley or rye, baked until nearly rock solid and capable of lasting for months. Dried or salted fish, especially cod and herring, air-cured until leathery and dense with protein. Dried meat, most often pork or beef, salted heavily and hung until it became tough and resistant to spoilage. Butter and lard, sometimes rancid by modern standards, but invaluable for calories and warmth. Fermented vegetables and sour porridges, preserved by acidity instead of fire. Hard, aged cheeses designed to travel. Ale or buttermilk, safer to drink than untreated water and easier to preserve. Nothing in this diet was comforting. That was never the intention. At sea, Vikings didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to slow the breakdown of the body. Each bite was meant to keep muscles moving, hands gripping oars, and minds clear enough to function in cold wind and exhaustion. Hunger was expected. Satisfaction was irrelevant. Food wasn't a reward. It was a delaying tactic against collapse. Meals on a Viking longship never happened at a table. There was no pause, no gathering, no moment set aside for eating. They happened while rowing. A longship functioned in constant motion, divided into shifts. Half the crew pulled the oars, muscles burning and lungs fighting the cold air. The other half rested briefly, cramped between benches, before rotating back into the rhythm. Food moved through the ship quickly, hand to hand, in simple wooden bowls with wooden spoons and personal knives. No plates, no fire, no ceremony. The deck was always wet, salt spray soaked clothing. The ship rolled and pitched without warning. Anything dropped bread, fish, a spoon was gone instantly, swallowed by the sea. There was no replacing it. Eating wasn't an experience. It was a task. Men lost weight rapidly as the days passed. Muscles weakened, energy thinned. Hunger stopped being a sensation and became a constant background pressure. Morale cracked slowly. Not in moments of drama, but in quiet exhaustion. This wasn't failure. It was expected. Warm food was never anticipated. Comfort was never promised. The Viking concept of endurance wasn't built on heroic pain or dramatic suffering. It was something colder and more deliberate. A slow, controlled degradation of the body that was managed, measured, and accepted as part of the journey. They didn't endure because they enjoyed it. They endured because they had prepared to. What often gets overlooked is just how advanced Viking food preservation really was. This wasn't primitive survival driven by desperation. It was engineering deliberate, tested, and refined through generations of seafaring. Every decision about food was tied to physics and balance. Supplies were stored low in the hull, close to the keel, where weight stabilized the ship instead of slowing it. Heavy barrels were positioned carefully. Nothing shifted freely. Everything had a place, because even a small imbalance could affect speed and control in rough seas. Containers were chosen with intention. Barrels were sealed tightly to keep out moisture. Leather bags were waxed to resist salt air. Woven nets allowed airflow, preventing mold while reducing weight. Wooden boxes were carved to fit specific foods, minimizing wasted space and movement. Salt preserved meat and fish, but it created another problem: thirst. That meant liquid management became just as critical as food storage. Ale and buttermilk weren't luxuries, they were safeguards against contaminated water. Fat solved another equation. Butter and lard compensated for calorie loss, providing dense energy in small amounts. Fermentation replaced fire, allowing food to last without heat. Nothing aboard existed for a single purpose. Food fed the body, stabilized the ship, and extended the range of the crew. Containers protected supplies while maintaining balance. Preservation methods reduced risk while increasing endurance. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was random. This system allowed Viking crews to travel farther, strike faster, and return home without relying on fire at sea. It wasn't just survival, it was power, carefully calculated and carried across the ocean. Without open flames, Viking survival depended on something far less dramatic than fire. It depended on time, bacteria, and preparation. Long before a ship ever touched the water, food was already being engineered for the voyage ahead. Stews were cooked on land, then sealed tightly inside clay or stone containers. Once aboard, these meals were never reheated. They didn't need to be. Slow fermentation and controlled storage kept them edible for days. Flavor didn't matter. Predictability did. Heat, when it was used, stayed on shore. Before departure or during brief landings, stones were heated in open fires until they burned with stored energy. Those stones were then dropped into wooden bowls or vessels, instantly boiling water or grain without exposing the container to flame. Once the ship sailed, the process stopped. No reheating, no second chance. Sour porridges fermented quietly in sealed pots, thickening over time into dense, calorie-heavy meals. Bread and dried fish softened through cold soaking alone, absorbing water or ale until they could be eaten. Fat, butter, and lard was added to almost everything, increasing energy intake without increasing volume. Nothing here was improvised. This was not sailors making do. It was a designed system. By replacing heat with chemistry and planning, Vikings removed cooking from the equation entirely. At sea, survival didn't depend on flame. It depended on foresight and the discipline to trust it. Modern audiences often ask the same question: why would anyone choose to live like this? The answer is uncomfortable, because Vikings did not define strength the way we do today. For them, strength was never comfort. It was control. Control over fear. Control over hunger. Control over the body when conditions stripped everything else away. To function while cold, wet, hungry, and exhausted was not seen as suffering. It was seen as capability. A crew that could keep rowing with numb hands, think clearly with an empty stomach, and obey discipline while deprived of warmth, arrived at its destination sharper, not weaker. This wasn't accidental toughness. It was cultivated. Viking crews trained their bodies and expectations to operate below comfort. They understood that comfort slowed reaction, weakened discipline, and created dependence. Hardship did the opposite. It stripped life down to essentials and left only what mattered: coordination, focus, and endurance. A ship that reached shore already hardened by deprivation was a weapon before the first blade was drawn. Enemies who expected warmth, rest, and routine met men who had already mastered discomfort. This mindset explains how Vikings crossed oceans without fire, and more importantly, why they kept winning once they arrived. They didn't survive the sea by resisting hardship. They survived by embracing control when comfort disappeared. The moment a Viking ship touched land, everything changed. Priorities reversed instantly. What had been forbidden at sea became essential on shore. Fire was no longer danger, it was relief. Driftwood was gathered without hesitation. A flame was lit as quickly as hands could manage. Water was set to boil. Grain was poured into pots. Meat, if any was available, was finally heated. At the center of it all stood a single massive communal pot. This wasn't indulgence. It was recovery. After days or weeks of cold food, exhaustion, and constant exposure, hot meals restored more than strength. They restored rhythm. Steam rising from stew meant the body could finally relax. Muscles loosened, breathing slowed. Pain dulled. Morale shifted almost immediately. Voices returned. Songs were sung. Jokes surfaced again. Weapons were repaired. Blades sharpened. Shields checked. Plans were discussed without urgency, because for the moment, survival was no longer in question. If time allowed, crews foraged. Shellfish along the shore. Edible plants. Freshwater fish. Anything that broke the monotony of dried food and salt. Even small additions mattered. Fire didn't just warm the body. It warmed the mind. A single hot meal could reset days of strain. It reminded the crew why the suffering at sea was endured in the first place, and prepared them to face it again when the ship pushed back into the water. So why does the myth of Vikings cooking at sea persist? Because we want ancient people to look familiar. We want to imagine them seeking comfort the way we would. Warm meals, open flames, a sense of normalcy in an alien world. But Vikings were not trying to feel comfortable. They were trying to survive. They did not conquer oceans with warmth or ease. They conquered them with preparation, discipline, and an extreme intolerance for risk. Fire aboard a wooden ship soaked in pitch, wool, and salt spray was not a convenience. It was a liability. So they removed it entirely. No cooking at sea. No open flame. No margin for a single spark to end everything. They ate food prepared long before departure. Dense, fatty, cold meals designed to sustain the body, not please the senses. They endured wet decks, freezing wind, and endless darkness without the psychological comfort of heat. And this was not ignorance. It was choice. Once you understand that, the real image of Viking life at sea changes completely. It isn't warmer. It isn't heroic in a romantic way. It is colder, darker, more disciplined, and far more impressive than the myth ever was. History doesn't belong to the comfortable. It belongs to those who adapted when comfort disappeared. If this changed how you see the Vikings, explore more with us. Because the darkest origins often reveal the strongest truths. Dark origins.